Good morning. Good morning and welcome, RCSD special educators. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are about to get started. We have for you today a 2-hour course that's going to focus in on data-driven IEP development. Before we start, I just want to explain that this presentation is actually the second piece of a 3-part series. So we started this series last May as a Department of Special Education, where we really dove into data-driven present levels of performance. So we are excited to kick off our second session with you. Please note that if you weren't in attendance in last May's presentation, we did send out those PowerPoint presentations via email, so you can review those to catch yourself up on something you may have missed. But just note that this is a part 2 of the presentation. What we'll do today is really take a deeper dive into data-driven IEPs in relation to our development of measurable annual goals. And then also speaking directly to the necessary progress monitoring of those goals that we are developing based on our data. So we are going to go ahead and kick that off today. As we get started, I would like to do a couple introductions. So my name is Amy Tata. I am one of the directors of special education for our district. And I do have an awesome team of presenters here today that I would like to introduce to you as well. We will start off with Shannon Markin. Shannon's gonna take herself off mute and introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Shannon Markin McMurtry. I'm an Associate Director of Special Education. I oversee 3 schools and support with instruction and behavior.
Thank you. We also have Shannon D'Agostino.
Shannon D'Agostino, I'm a teacher coordinator of special education and I support instruction for special ed.
Thank you, Shannon. And we also have Eugene McNamara.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gene McNamara. I'm the Associate Director of Special Education Compliance, and I'm here to support the district and the special education staff on compliance issues and regulatory issues regarding special education.
Eugene. So just wanted to share this presentation that we have developed today has been done collaboratively by this team that you see on the screen today, along with some other department administrators and support. We also have collaborated on this presentation with the New York State Education Department's Office of Special Education Regional Partnership Center. So we do collaborate with the specialists from the Regional Partnership Center, or the RPC, to provide professional development that meets the standards of New York State Education Department. So we did want to share that. As we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items that I want to address right off the bat. So as you all know, this professional development today is provided via the live stream YouTube link. However, we did require that you please go into True North Logic and register for this course so that you can receive your state certification credit for attending. You will also get that True North Logic survey that will be sent to you after the completion of this. At the very end of the presentation, we have a link to a survey that will take you to how you get that survey from True North Logic. So that more to come on that. But if you haven't registered, please make sure you contact True North Logic so you can get the credit that should be awarded to you for attending this course. We also have sent this presentation. If you would like to follow along with us on your own screen, we have sent the link to the Google presentation to all of those who have registered for the True North Logic course in True North. So you should have gotten an email, and I see many of you in there right now, so you can click along with us if you would like. Because of the format of this PD and the vast amount of special ed teachers and providers we have on this live stream, we're not able to do a live chat feature and answer questions in real time. However, we do want to hear from you. We have created a parking lot so that you can, as you are listening to the presentation, enter questions or comments that you might have onto that form. The link is on the slide that you're seeing on your screen right now. If you are jumping into the presentation, you can click on that. We will be collecting all of those questions and creating a frequently asked questions document that we'll send out after the presentation, along with another copy of the presentation, just so you have all of the materials that we're going to be going through today. So that's how we'll get questions or comments that come up because we do want to hear from you if you have something that you need further clarification on, etc. So those are our housekeeping items. Okay, so we are going to go through the agenda for today. As you know, we've already done our introductions. We will be in a minute looking at unpacking our learning objectives for the day and really talk about the why and the rationale for this course on data-driven IEP development that relates to goals. We're going to review some of the key takeaways from the part 1 of the series. If you weren't able to participate, we are going to unpack a little bit of that today and review it as a group. We're also going to break down how to create a measurable annual goal that is focused on data that aligns to the baseline in the PLEP, as well as go through key information from progress monitor, how we can progress monitor our goals, and we'll share some resources with you for future work at the very end. We do plan to take about a 5-minute break halfway through the presentation to give you a little bit of time to stretch and reflect, and also maybe go and visit that parking lot if you haven't had a chance to.
So for learning objectives today, I can understand the difference between a non-compliant, a compliant, and a quality IEP. We're going to go through that. We are also going to talk about constructing an IEP that establishes baseline data in the present levels of performance, which will then align to that measurable annual goal. And we are going to work on making sure that everyone can identify data points to collect and provide data-based assessment of student progress regarding their annual goals.
So our goal, based on feedback from the State Education Quality Assurance Team and the consent decree, target areas for improvement that are no longer just simply about compliance. We are really looking to develop quality IEPs that meet the mandates for both of those pieces.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, part of my my role and responsibility is to work with compliance within the district around the IEPs, working directly with Part 200 regulations of the Commissioner of Education. And part of that is to also work with the Special Education Quality Assurance Team. And you can see that along the top of this slide. And basically, we recently had a CEQA review. And within their review, they took a look at the district IEPs. They took a look at our process and procedures and determined that we needed a compliance assurance plan, which we refer to as a CAP, or some of you in the past have heard them as corrective action plans. And the key point within that corrective action plan was to take a look at our baseline data within our present levels of performance. And as you can see from this slide, it's a good representation to show that as the IEP is developed and it grows, we need to have that foundation of good baseline data connecting to each of the components of the IEP as it lined right here. So within the present levels, we have had some really good writing from staff members describing students, describing their needs. We've done some really great narratives over the years. And now each of those narratives work into the different pieces you see here, the accommodations, the supports and modifications. And then it builds down into what kind of supplementary aids does a student need, or whether or not they need special transportation or testing accommodations, and then eventually related services. But the key point to it are the goals in which the students are working on. And so as we have those narratives to describe and support all of the other parts of the IEP, the state education has looked at our IEPs and have said they are lacking the baseline data that we need in order to align and connect directly with our goals. And part of what we're going to do today is we're going to really tease that out and say, well, what does that look like when we talk about the baseline data for a goal? But in short, when we write a goal, we need to be able to give currently where the student presently is with that goal. So if we're going to say, hey, we're going to reach 80% by the end of the year, we must identify in our baseline data in the PLEPs where that child is currently. Maybe they're at 65% of that goal right now. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'll share a little bit more on the alignment with the baseline data and the present levels as it reflects on the rest of the IEP.
Thanks, Jean.
Thank you.
So this presentation is the continuation, as Amy shared, of our data-driven part 1. And last Friday, we did send out that PowerPoint along with the reminder email to register for this PD, just for your reference. The goals of our first presentation really focused on ensuring that the present levels contained all the necessary information in order to align with the various components of the IEP, as well as developing an understanding of how to utilize a variety of data sources. Today, we continue our work by considering these data sources from the present levels and how they inform the development of our measurable annual goals.
So if you take a look at this, this slide, it really is a good representation of how the present levels connect to each part of the IEP. And one of the things that you can do with this slide when you look back and you start developing your IEPs is that it goes in both directions. You can write your present levels of performance and then move to the other sections of the IEP and see what is needed. But the other thing you can do as a check is you can look back on the IEP and go to supplemental aids and accommodations and look and say, okay, this is what the child needs, we're recommending. Do we describe that up above in the present levels of performance? If you can do that, that's a good check that we're covering the things that the state is looking for, because not only did they look at the baseline data for our goals, but they went through each and every portion of the IEP and said, well, why do you have this accommodation here? It's not mentioned up above that the child needs, let's just say, extended time. We have to have a narrative up above. The one thing I want to just say is that we do not have to have baseline data for every piece of the child's needs. We need that baseline data for the goals and for the other pieces that are really kind of describing a support that the child needs. Again, you move up through this and you look at a testing accommodations, and you should be able to go back to the present levels and say, this test accommodation matches this need of the child. And again, the goals, you look at the goal, and if the goal is for, let's just say it's a writing goal, you should be going up into the section of the present levels that describes what the child currently can do. And you should be able to say, currently the child's only performing this task at 60%, and we're asking him to do 80%. That would be a good alignment within the goals. So it's just a good representation to go back and forth and see how you can not only write your present levels for the IEP, but then check the IEP to see if it matches with the present levels.
So as we were preparing for this professional learning, we reviewed a lot of different IEPs to help inform our practice and development for this. And also in addition to what Jean just said, you know, if we are saying that a student needs something in their IEP, we need to get away from this language of benefits from. So when we say benefits from in the IEP, it is more of a suggestion rather than a clearly stated need. If the statement is the student benefits from an environment with reduced distractions, we need to change that to the student requires an environment that has reduced visual distractions, as well as one that is quiet during direct instruction and independent work time. So it really needs to align with the other areas of the IEP and really should be a need or a requirement, not just something they simply benefit from.
Absolutely. So with that being said, we're going to segue right into the development of our measurable annual goals. So here on the screen, you're going to see what is stated actually in Part 200 regulations as to what the definition of measurable annual goals are. So an annual goal is a statement that identifies what knowledge, skills, and or behaviors a student is expected to be able to demonstrate within the year, 1 year, that the IEP will be in effect from the start to the end of the IEP. So in our district, in RCSD, as you all know, we are under anniversary date IEPs, which means that our IEPs are written for 1 calendar year versus the school year that some other districts do it in that way. So keeping that in mind, the start and end of the IEP does not necessarily align up with school year, but with the calendar year.
This is just a really great graphic to think about as you're developing those annual goals. We start with our present level. We consider the two, actually our quarterly progress monitoring that occurs and where we want that student to be at the end of that, calendar year. So in that 365 days as it follows the anniversary IEP in our current district.
Okay, so some key points to consider. So these are kind of the overview of what we're going to go through today. So the goal is going to be skill-based, not standard or curriculum-based. We want to really think about what skill is the student going to do rather than what, piece of curriculum the student is going to do. It should be both observable and measurable. We're really going to talk about that. The goal is what bridges that baseline data, right? Going back to what Shannon just shared on the road slide, that baseline data in the PLEP to that end of the year expectation. And we're going to state what the student will do as opposed to what they will not do. So really making sure that our language is going to show what the student is doing. So this slide is really one of those slides where we take all those components of the goal and kind of connect them to a way that we can visualize it as we're developing it. So when we talk about the annual goal, I want everyone to think about this skill and ask yourself those questions. What will the student do? To what extent, under what conditions? When we think about the criteria, the end result, that's where we want the student to be at the end. So how well or how often does the student have to demonstrate this for us to consider that the goal's been mastered? And that's going to depend on the goal. Your criteria period is going to be your measure. Over what period of time does the student have to perform that skill to let you know that they've mastered it? So the end result, right? If we want it to be this, how long do they have to perform at that measure to let you know that they have mastered the skill? Your method is your tool. What procedure or tool will you use to collect that data for progress monitoring? And then your schedule is the interval. How often will the method be used to collect data so progress can be monitored? The schedule is not when we are sending the reports from Frontline to parents. The schedule is a part of the goal and how often you are going to analyze that data.
If I could just add one piece to that, Shannon.
Yeah.
When you're doing the measurement of the goals, we also need to include data. We need to give those percentages or those trials of where the child is currently, because that is also a match to what the state looks for our progress monitoring and then for the following year's goals.
Thanks, Jean. So next we're going to begin looking at how to develop those meaningful annual goals that are skill or behavior focused, and they have to be observable and measurable.
So in thinking about what a student will do, want to think more about skills versus a concept. And this concept itself can be a little tricky when we're thinking about students and what we want them to do. So when we think about skills, we want to think about application, action. This is something that can be practiced. It can be mastered. It might involve steps. It might not. It's observable, right? We can see the student demonstrate this. You can lose a skill if not practiced. I don't know how proficient I would be at riding a bike these days. It's been a while. So you can lose a skill if you don't keep up on it. And you can perform a skill without understanding the concept of it. So, you can teach a trick for a student to be able to multiply fractions doing the butterfly method, but do they really know the concept of what they're doing? When we think about concepts, we're answering those big questions. How, why? They're those deep ideas. It's a broad understanding. Students can pull that prior experience. And once learned, concepts are easy to retain, right? So the concept of riding a bike is you get on it, you pedal and you balance, but to actually do it might be a little more complex. Understanding concepts make learning the skill easier. So when you have an understanding of that how and why, applying that skill can be a little easier for the student. So that's something that we can consider in our scaffolding as we are working on the goals with students. You can understand a concept, but not be able to perform the skill. And I can think of a lot of concepts that I understand, but I don't think I would be very proficient at those skills. So they are similar in the sense that they can both be built upon. They can be taught progressively or simultaneously. So, thinking about teaching, adding and subtracting simultaneously, they're both concepts, they're both skills, they're inverse operations. So it's something that can be done simultaneously. They can be learned. You can learn a skill, you can learn a concept, and there's a natural progression or order. So if you think about standards, that vertical alignment, right? You're not gonna teach a student to inference if they have no idea how to even answer basic questions, right? So we want to make sure that it's a scaffolded process. This slide is going to be, there's a resource at the very end of this PD where this slide is there, as well as guiding questions to help you figure out skill and concept. So the reason why we are focusing on skill is because it's measurable. You can see it in order to measure it. It can be observed. So a student may understand the concept of subtraction, making less, but they may not be able to apply the skill and actually compute on their own. So that would be, the goal would be to complete that skill. And I think, so this is an area where, we talk at length about those drop downs, right? Those drop down prompts, and most of them are standard based, and not all of the standards are necessarily a skill. Some of them are more concept based. So we need to be really careful when we use the drop down. And if you can identify the skill that you want the student to do, you may want to create the custom goal, because it's going to be much simpler for you to state what you need the student to do than it would be to use a skill or a standard that may not even be a skill. So it might be helpful to really do that custom goal and think about those skills, and use the resource at the end of this. It has those guiding questions for you.
And if you're struggling to identify a goal or create a custom goal, that's something that your associate director or district representative during the CSE meeting can help you with. Okay, so we're just going to do a little checks for understanding here. So I'm going to read each of these, and I just want you to take a minute and reflect on whether it's a skill or a concept. So to solve is a skill. Understand is a concept. Know is a concept. Display is a skill. Write is a skill. To compute is a skill. To read is a skill. And learn is a concept. So think about these in one of the goals that you might have most recently selected for one of your students, and think about whether that goal was really skill-based or concept-based, considering this language.
So this really leads us to wonder and think about this question. If we hadn't collected the baseline data, how do we know what skills need to be addressed for that student for their measurable annual goal? As we think about that, and as we think about the difference between skills and concepts, and how we need to be identifying what the student will need to do at the end date of their IEP, we need to think about isolating those most important skills. One of the things, and I know Jean has been doing some talking about some of the feedback that we've been getting from the Special Ed Quality Assurance Office from New York State, as well as our own review of IEPs. And some of the things that we see are combining many skills in one goal. And this is something that we want to address and pare down so that we are identifying and isolating the most important skills. And part of what was just spoke about in a few slides before this regarding the frontline dropdown. Sometimes in those frontline dropdowns, those goals that in there have lots of skills in them that we'd be asking the student to do many things just in order to be able to do that one goal. I know that Gene has some examples. He wants to unpack a quick example for us of something that we've seen or something similar to what we've seen where a goal has way too many skills identified, which would make it very difficult for the student to be able to achieve that by the end date of the IEP.
One of the examples that comes to mind that I see frequently is within a writing goal. And you may have the IEP writing goal starts off that, when given a prompt, the student will be able to write a 4-paragraph essay that will include the introductory, 2 pieces of data, a conclusion that has inferences in it, that has a overall arching theme is thrown into it. And as you can see, those are multiple skills for a child to do within the writing process. And then what we've also found is when you go back up and you link up to the present levels, we don't have where the child currently is with any of those skills. So when identifying a writing skill or any of the goals that we're looking at, we do want them to be specific to that one skill. It needs to be observable, measurable. Now, yes, writing a complete essay or a 4-paragraph essay, including and then putting in parentheses, introductory, body and conclusion, that would be describing that 4-paragraph. Adding those other pieces, how do you measure that if they miss maybe an inference, but they get everything else right? They left out the inference. Did they meet that goal? So that's why it has to be broken up, is if one of those components of the goal is missing, now you're kind of doing they got it, sort of, and now it becomes an opinion piece versus an actual database that you can use in your baseline data for the progress monitoring. So that's pretty much the example that I would give around the multiple segments. The other piece, just another example, would be within math. We do see a lot of concepts within math where they're going to use the order of operations in order to solve multi-step word problems, including carrying and borrowing. Now we're getting into carrying and borrowing and etc. Those are multiple steps. So those are the examples that I would give that frequently show up. The one other piece that I would put that I think Shannon was talking about when it comes to the concept is that learning how to do something. And sometimes we see this in a social skills goal where we will hear the child, or it will read, the child will learn how to interact with other students. That doesn't really give me a lot. Learn how to interact. How? Will they use a certain coping skill? That's different. The student will use this skill when confronted with frustration. That can be measured. The learning piece of it, not necessarily. The implementation of it, yes, they can. Does that, hopefully that helps give an example there.
Perfect. Thank you, Jean. It really does. And actually, as we go through the presentation, we are going to be showing an example and we're going to be building upon it. So you'll see that coming up in a few slides. But before we jump into that, I do want to talk about the present levels of performance and kind of 4 big areas, what we need to make sure we are doing in our present level of performance when we're talking about the connection to the measurable annual goal. So first and foremost, we know that we have to be identifying baseline data in the present levels of performance itself. And if for every goal that is listed, and I know that we've said this a few times and we'll continue to talk about it as we go on, every goal on the IEP must have some data that is present in the present levels of performance. So we need to be able to make that connection where we see it listed in the present levels that's attached to that goal for every single goal. We also need to make sure that we are using assessments that are either district assessments or classroom or teacher-made assessments that are aligned with the general education curriculum and standards so that we are collecting evidence based on those pieces. So we talked a lot about that in our last presentation, and there will be some more resources that are coming up about our new diagnostic piece with iReady that will be coming to you guys later on this week. We need to make sure that we are using some of this kind of language when we're developing in our baseline data. For example, blank words read correctly, or the number of times the behavior occurred should be listed in a number, or 2 out of 6. Those are some examples of what we might see in the present levels of performance with that data. We also know that our baseline data is our starting point. When we receive the IEP and we start working on that goal with that child, we know that's where we're starting. And then we know where we need to end at the end date of the IEP based on what is written in the goal and what we are asking the child to achieve by that end date.
So when selecting baseline data, it needs to be specific to the skill or behavior that's being measured. And we're going to look at this one specifically around NWEA because that is a common K-8 assessment. So if utilizing data from the NWEA, for example, it may give you an approximate grade level, but not a specific skill. Where in that grade level is there a skill breakdown? Start there with your baseline assessment. Then we're going to move to the objective. Others will be able to measure it and get the same results. So most important for behavior skills tracking, what does disrupting look like? It needs to be measurable. It can be observed, counted, or measured. How are you measuring or tracking this? Could a substitute, a teaching assistant, co-teacher, gen ed teacher, or any other person who comes into your classroom track this? And then frequency. It is measured often to adjust the instructional approach. So using the NWEA, state tests, regions, etc., it may not allow you to progress monitor frequently or adjust your instruction. So using a classroom-based formative assessment allows you to collect data in a natural, frequent way without always having to create a test or use that test. So really thinking about what baseline assessment could you create in order to measure.
So we're going to go through some examples. This first one is an academic example. So the present level data statement is based on classroom devised formative assessments targeting solving real world multi-step word problems, including 2 or more operations. Student was able to solve 0 out of 5 problems. Student, however, was able to identify key math vocabulary using a highlighter. So this could be part of the narrative that you would see in the PLEP. We've talked about what the assessment was, what the goal of it was, the very specifics of the word problems, and how many the student was able to solve. We also identified what the student could do, right? So they may not have been able to solve the problem, but they were able to identify some of that math vocabulary. So this is very specific data. We know that the problems were multi-step. We know that they had multiple operations. So that is going to give us a target of where we want to start to work on the goal. So we're going to take that data, put it into a goal. Student will be able to solve real world multi-step word problems, including 2 or more operations. So now I know that I am looking for that from the student, and it is a skill. I can see them do it because they have to compute to come up with an answer. They have to demonstrate this. Now, if this is my goal on my IEP, looking back at that data statement, I know maybe they need some support with they can identify the keywords, but maybe they don't know what they mean. So we can support the student starting at a scaffold right there. Let's talk about what these words mean. When I see this word, I know that the operation is this. We could also start with single step word problems, right? Our data is assessing multi-step. So let's scale it back and start with single step word problems. And then we can go from there. So when you have really detailed data, that's also, yes, it helps you identify your goal, but it's also going to help you identify where to start and what scaffolds to put in for the student. So I also want to note, based on what Shannon just shared on the previous slide, this was a classroom assessment. This could have been an end of the unit assessment. It could have been a pre-test. The teacher did not have to do a a big formalized, assessment on this student to get this data. They were able to do it in a very natural way. It wasn't additional time that needed to be spent. And, sometimes we talk about over testing our kids. So, using the tools that we already have to collect that data. So the next example is also an academic example. So our data statement is based on the 200 CVC word list. Student was able to identify 6 out of 20 presented CVC words comprised of all 5 short vowel families. So here's my formal list. It's a CVC word list and there's 200 words. Well, we're not going to test a kid on 200 words at once. So the teacher was able to pick out 20 words, but looking again, comprised of 5 short vowels. So it was A-E-I-O-U, there was 20 words, and the student was only able to identify 6. So that's a really detailed piece of data that's going to drive my goal. Student will be able to identify CVC words comprised of all 5 vowel sounds. So again, most of the time when we have a student who's well below grade level, typically the CVC word is a good place to start because we can build from there. That's going to tell us, okay, we can go up from here if they know them, but we can go down from here if they don't. And then we know where to put in those scaffolds.
And I just want to say too, it's another simple assessment measure that the teacher selected based on what she knew about that student's needs. So this is not something that we use standard across all of our K2 classrooms. This is a resource that you can find online and is really easily accessible.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I were to take the lens that CEQA uses in looking at the present levels and going down to a goal, they would look at this and they would say, here's the data, here's the baseline data in the present level that develops a goal. So they've linked right there. There's another step that needs to be there, and that would be, again, the percentage of what we're asking that student to do as the end result of the goal. And what we don't want to see is, obviously, we don't want to see, oh, the student is doing it at 60% and the goal is only measuring to be able to do it at 40%, which, believe it or not, we have seen in a couple of cases. But this is exactly how they would look at it. They would look at the present levels. Actually, they do it reverse. They'll go to the goal and then they'll go back up and look in the present levels to see if it matches.
And I think that brings up a good point, Jean. As a CSE chairperson, that's what I've been doing as I prepare for CSE meetings. And I know some of my teachers on here are probably nodding their head because I usually start with the goals and then I look back up at the present levels of performance to see if they align. If they don't align, then that's when conversation happens, because I know that the information is usually there. It's just how we write it. So it's not that you don't have that information, teachers. It's just those probing questions sometimes that we have to ask in order to get what we need to develop those present levels of performance. So I told you this presentation was coming, so here it is.
Yeah. And that's important that you said it that way, that sometimes, as educators, we write and we know what it is we want the student to do based on what we've seen, based on our professionalism, and we write it. And sometimes it's not clear to maybe the parent or somebody from the outside. So that's a good point, Shannon, that you would have to ask. Let's clarify. Let's make sure that we've made sure we articulate it very well in the present levels in order for it to match. So thanks.
Dean, you also brought up another really good point that I do want to bring us back to is we also need to, in our goals, as we know, establish the criteria and the criteria period. You'll notice in the first 2 examples that we went through so far with Shannon is we don't have that year there yet. We are, throughout the rest of our presentation, we'll build that in as we unpack each piece of it. So this, important to being identifying the skill first. Right. And then looking at, okay, well, what's our criteria? What's our criteria period? All of the pieces that I need to put in place after I have established what that skill is. So thank you for bringing that point up. And then I think I'll turn it over to you, Shannon. I think you are going to use this secondary example.
Yes, so this is considering that social emotional learning and sometimes the goals that we put in place for student behavior. So looking at that data statement and utilizing the age appropriate transition tool. Again, something we're already doing. You're already doing it for the IEP. Let's use the data from that to establish your goal. That way, we're again working smarter, not harder. We already have to collect this information. So let's use that as our baseline data. So using that tool, the student has identified accepting responsibility for themselves is an area needing further development. So the student identified that. Now you're putting your observation during group work tasks. Student has been observed identifying others' perspectives when conflict occurs within the group 40% of the time. So this is teacher-based data that has been collected, and we're able to put a quantity to it. However, when student is not able to identify others' perspectives, student refuses to participate in conflict resolution, and the assignment is not complete. So we have a full picture. The student identifies this as a weakness. The teacher has identified this as a weakness with data, and it's leading into other situations where now the student's getting frustrated and they're not completing their assignment. They're not participating in the conflict resolution. So again, that extra information is going to show you those scaffolds that you can put into place when working with the student. So going back to what Amy said, really just isolating the skill or behavior. Don't think about all the other pieces, only focus on that skill or behavior. So based on this information and group task conflicts, student will identify the perspective of others and remain an active participant during the resolution. So they've got to be able to identify and kind of sit through that resolution. That's what we're looking for from this goal.
So I just want to remind everyone about the language of this data source. So the age appropriate transition tool is, if you're familiar with the level 1 assessment that we've used in past years, this is our own new district created transition tool that we are using for all of our students that are turned 12 years and older. So it's done first at age 12, and then it's done again after age 15, and it is put right in the IEP under those coordinated set of transition. But this is a great tool to start kind of having those beginning conversations. The survey about that really is very informative in data collection around how the student feels about themselves, right? And how they see themselves in supporting in the classroom, and how they see themselves as a community member. So I just wanted to remind everybody about what this tool actually is, because the new level, it is replacing the level 1 if you're not familiar with that language.
Thanks, Shannon. That's a really good point. And we as a district made that decision to align with the common language that New York State Education Department is using around that assessment, as well as they've shifted their language too. So go ahead, Jean.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this present level statement also has another component in it that is really critical when we're looking at development of a quality IEP. There is a section on the IEP that talks about how the student's disability impacts their progress or their ability to progress in the general education curriculum. And actually that last little statement where it just says, when the student's not able to identify other perspectives, the student refuses to participate in conflict resolution and assignments are not completed. That shows that the disability, which I'm assuming is since it's part of the present levels, this is one of the difficulties in their disability that impacts the general education, their participation. And so when we look at that section also by CEQA, that other piece, we do look back into the present levels for a statement like this to say, here's how the child's disability is keeping them from progressing in the gen ed curriculum. So this would be part also just a piece of a statement. It kind of stood out as I read it this time.
Thank you. Okay, we've reached a point in the presentation where we want to give you the opportunity to stretch and reflect, maybe get up, walk around, use the restroom, or take this opportunity to go back to that parking lot. Maybe there's something in the first half of the presentation that you had a question about or you'd like more information on. That's an opportunity for you to visit that, or possibly you need to take the opportunity to connect with True North Logic if you did not register for this course so that you can receive the credit and survey. So please go ahead and take those the time to do those items, and we will set a timer for 5 minutes and we'll come back. We'll leave that showing so that you know when it's time to get back on and dig into the second half of this presentation. All right, welcome back. We had a chance to get up, move around, stretch, take care of a few things that you needed to get done today. We're going to dive back in. We're going to look at the second half of our presentation, and we will be looking a little deeper into the next part of the goal as we develop it. And while Shannon's getting this screen up, I will share on the break. I was actually thinking about this and I wanted to make sure I shared it with you all. I know that since we are in such a large group today, we don't have the live opportunity to ask questions. And yes, we did share that parking lot, but I did also want to share that as a department, we consistently have office hours that are occurring during, I think it's Wednesdays, but we're going to send out that schedule that we have with our instructional coaches and our behavior coaches that can meet on a weekly basis if needed to support teachers individually. In addition to that, we're going to be developing some office hours that really help and look at compliance pieces, especially with writing goals. If you have a specific question and you want to drop into an office hour, we will be able to have that available to you. So that is an additional opportunity to get some support outside of possibly your associate director. So I just wanted to share that.
Amy, can I just, I'm getting a lot of messages that are concerns about our PD being full. So they're unable to register in True North Logic. So we are, I'm addressing that right now. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, we should be able to have everybody register. It's not full. We can have as many participants as we need. It's just I have to fix the cap on it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that update. So rest assured, we will make sure that you can get registered and you can get the credit that you will get for attending today. So thank you for that update. So let's dive in. Let's take a look at the criteria and criteria period. So when we think about the criteria and the criteria period, it is what tells us if we are going to be able to make sure the goal has been achieved. So it's our measurement. How are we going to measure if the student achieves this goal within the entirety of the IEP?
So when we think about the criteria, we are thinking about the end result. How well must the student perform to demonstrate proficiency of the skill or behavior identified? What you see here are some of the prompts that we can find in Frontline Accuracy. So 90%, 80%, 75%. Duration, how long a student is going to perform that skill or behavior. The frequency, so number of times the student will perform that skill or behavior. Speed, distance, number of trials, a time frame. So example, 2 minutes after a direction is given. And again, remembering that this is by the end of the IEP. So it's not necessarily a September to June, it's through the life of the IEP. When we consider accuracy, there's a little star there, and that's really only to be used during more academic based goals, because, you know, those are, it's just going to be, the goal is going to be more on getting it correct. And so it would be more appropriate. But when we think of that, so we're going to pick accuracy for a reading goal. So we say that the student's going to answer comprehension questions based on an instructional level test with 80% accuracy. So we need to think about, are those questions always the same? Are they W-based questions or are they inferential-based questions? Because now that's a significant difference, right? We're changing, you know, that comprehension could be changing. So, you know, those W-based questions are, you know, our basic comprehension, but when we go to those inferential based, now we're looking at those higher order thinking skills, you know. So when we say comprehension questions, we want to be careful and make sure that we're going to identify that if we really want to be accurate. We also have to consider, you know, is there always going to be the same number of questions, right? So if a student reads a passage and sometimes they have 10 questions, sometimes they have 30 questions, that can play a role, especially if they're different. You know, we've got our basic and our inferential based questions. So, you know, just really making sure that when we're using that accuracy, that our goal is very explicit so that we're giving an accuracy. So some of these terms might not always, depending on your students and their goals, you may not always use some of this criteria. So when we think about accuracy, duration, time frame, those measurements, this is just kind of a guide of when it would be appropriate to use that. So when we consider speed, okay, so speed, it's not necessarily appropriate for a special ed student to have speed on utilizing their coping skills, right? But we can measure speed through reading fluency or math fluency. Frequency, it's a great one for study skills and behavior because those are situational based. Trials, that's definitely going to be a behavior based. Duration, so how long is the student going to remain on task for study skills? Behavior, how long can the student, stay out of a conflict? How long can a student read independently? So really kind of considering when we would use those. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure, related service providers, social workers, we can all come up with a ton of goals that might fit these, but in general, these are, the appropriate places that we would use these sort of criteria.
I was also going to say, Shannon, that, this is sometimes as classroom teachers, we work to write a social emotional goal or, some type of language goal. So this is a great list to think about as you're developing goals that may be, looking not at an academic area, but something that's social emotional. All right, so it's time for another check for understanding. So is the term observable and measurable? Solve. It's a skill, so yes. Understand is a concept, so no, it is not observable or measurable. To know something is also a concept, not observable and measurable. To display something, so you can see it, yes, it's a skill. To write something is yes, observable and measurable, it's a skill. To compute, for my math friends, yes, it's a skill. Yes, it's observable and measurable. To read something is a skill, so yes, it's observable and measurable. And learn, I hope we said no, that's a concept and it is not observable or measurable. So we constantly need to think about this and we play this balancing game when we create goals. So we need to balance the present levels of skill with grade level expectations. The criteria needs to be challenging to encourage that growth. However, 100% accuracy leaves no room for error. The goal needs to be just right, not too easy and not too hard. So I'm thinking, in my role as a CSE chairperson, if you're not sure about a goal, we are sending those draft IEPs home 14 days prior. And if there's a goal on there that you develop that maybe isn't the best goal, it's a goal that's on that draft IEP, we can continue to have those conversations at CSE to make sure that we really are thinking about, is this goal attainable for what that student's present skill level is? And does it really consider that grade level expectation and rigor? So if it's on that draft IEP, it's not the end all, but there will be conversation at CSE guided by your chairperson to really help you come to, that understanding or that agreement on what that goal should really look like.
Shannon, can I just share? I just want to make sure everyone understands that the goal does not have to be a grade level skill. So that's, when we have that baseline assessment, that's telling us that the student is not on grade level for that skill. However, we want to take that skill level and think about how we can progress them towards the grade level with the expectations and rigor. So you're not going to start with a grade, a skill that's 3 grade levels below, and we're going to bring them to grade level in 1 year. That may not happen. So how can we kind of bridge that present level to a goal, right? And the goal doesn't always have to be grade level, but it should still have rigor in it. It shouldn't be so easy that the student can achieve it and all they needed was somebody to work on it with them for a few weeks and now they've got it. right? So we want to make sure that we try to find that balance. And when we do those drop downs in our goal bank and we select that one standard, that's such a teeny tiny minute part of what they're expected to learn in a year, we're not necessarily expanding and challenging our students. So that's why, again, thinking about custom goals. So going back to some of the goals that we were sharing is our examples, that practice, that goal of CVC words. Well, if a student can read CVC words in all short vowels, they can read blends, beginning blends, ending blends. So you can expand on that. If they meet the goal before the end of the school year, you can still expand on that and continue teaching the student and getting them to grow with that expectation.
And I know what everyone's thinking, creating a goal for a high school student reflective of their present skill level might be challenging. So later in the presentation, we're going to talk about conditions that can also support that student in accessing that grade level content or that grade level skill using some type of resource, such as a calculator. So we'll touch on that. So don't worry too much about that right now. I know that the brains are going, how am I supposed to create this goal, knowing that they're at this level?
So when you are drafting your IEPs and you are beginning to think about developing the criteria period for your students' goals, we want you to be thinking that about the main statement in the center, the main question in the center. How long will it really take for the student to be able to do that skill or behavior at the proficiency level that is stated in the criteria? So we need to think about that time frame. How long are we going to need them to do it at proficiency? Then we want to ask ourselves, going to the orange shape, let's think about now how consistently we need to see it in order to demonstrate mastery. And then how are we going to make sure that we are measuring it in a time frame that is no more than 10 weeks, that is never consecutive. We also need to consider that we could measure by number of days, we could measure by weeks, or over 3 days, or over 3 weeks. Those would be some examples. And then also we could measure based on an occasion during math class, for example, or on 6 occasions. Some things to think about as you are drafting your criteria period.
So these are the same goals that we talked about earlier. And this one is our the academic goal on the word problems, real world multi-step word problems. So we had just talked about the goal in the beginning. So now we've got that very specific goal based on data. Our criteria, we're going to say 80%, 4 out of 5. So that's going to tell me, or, because our IEPs are not necessarily September to June, the next year's teacher, we're looking for about 4 out of 5. So we're only going to have about 5 problems when we assess the student. And how long do they have to demonstrate that mastery? So I'm looking for the student to be able to do this 80% of the time over 6 weeks to show mastery. So when I'm choosing that criteria period, I'm considering the complexity of the goal. So this is a more complex goal, right? Sometimes the real world multi-step problem might be something, that's the student has that background information and they've connected to it. So they're going to answer really well this time. The next time, maybe they don't have that background information, or maybe they're really struggling with, one operation over another. So we want to be able to see this over a period of 6 weeks in order to say that the student has really mastered the skill. The CVC word list goal. This is a more basic goal, and it's kind of one of those goals that once that light goes off and the student gets it, they get it. So we're looking for 90% on 5 occasions. So this is something where we already talked about in the baseline data that they were presented with 20 words. So we're going to keep giving them 20 words, and it's going to be, a mix of A, E, I, O, U short vowels. And on 5 occasions, they need to have a 90% or higher. With 5 occasions, this is something, again, we can progress monitor this right in class. We can do this in our small groups. We can do this at the end as an exit ticket. This does not necessarily have to be a formal one-on-one. We're going to sit down and progress monitor your IEP goals right now. This can be something that's naturally embedded.
And this would be a great goal that you could have your teaching assistant or support staff support you with. And I know sometimes our elementary teachers, high school teachers are thinking about, when am I going to do this? When am I going to do the progress monitoring of my IEP goals? How am I going to look at that? So this would be a great place for you to have these already ready to go. And we'll talk more about that, and have a support staff, support you in assessing the student. And not necessarily a formal way that requires you to do that.
So our social emotional example here, this one, we chose 90% criteria and a criteria period 9 out of 10 occasions. This is a situational based goal. We are looking for certain situations where there's some sort of group conflict. I, as the teacher, know that this is something that happens often enough for me to be able to collect some data on it. So it's a situational time. So we're not going to look for accuracy or trials. We can't set up a trial for the student to do this. This has to naturally occur. So that's why we're looking for occasions. So 90% is 9 out of 10 occasions. And so when developing more of that social emotional, sometimes a lot, they're often situational, and you might want to take that backwards design approach where, okay, let me think about this number of times it could happen over the course of the year, and then I'm going to pick my criteria. So using a backwards design, because you've got to consider the occasions or trials.
Okay, we're going to move ahead to the next component of developing the measurable annual goal, which is looking at the method and the schedule. We are going to be thinking about how and when we will progress monitor the goal. What I want to share on this slide is this is not when we're reporting progress to parents. And I know we've talked about that earlier in the presentation. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but we need to be thinking about the method and schedule as when we're going to progress monitor how they're doing at that goal, not when we're going to report progress. We wouldn't wait until the end of the quarter to find out how they are doing on their CBC work list. We would be progress monitoring per the method and schedule that's drafted in the IEP goal, or that's written in the IEP goal.
And as Amy just shared, and I'm going to say it again because I think this is so important, we should be, progress monitoring our students' IEP goals more frequently than when we report out to families. Okay, so the method for how we do that is the tool that we will use to collect data for progress monitoring of the goal. And this may very well look like a very similar method to what your baseline data was, whatever tool you used initially. And that schedule is how often you will use the tool to collect and analyze the data for that goal. So this is when you're looking at your data, if it's every 2 weeks, and you are sitting down, you're saying, okay, here's how they're doing at solving a multi-step equation. And this is what I need to adjust in order to help them make more progress during that next scheduled period.
Shannon, before we go to the next slide, I do want to give a little shout out on method and schedule and progress monitoring. Our related service providers do a really great job at this. All of their goals are very specific to a schedule that is progress monitored, so that when they do their related service log session notes, they are using that data after every session. They're reflecting, they're collecting, they're assessing, they're making decisions about how they are working with that student on that goal. So just a shout out to all our SLPs and our OTPT related service staff. You guys do a great job at this, so thank you for that.
If I could also add to that, if there's ever a situation where maybe a parent doesn't agree with the way we're setting up goals or that we're monitoring them, or even just basically saying, I think my child can do this more or not as often. This is really where that collection of data can also come in handy, is to be able to show, look, here is the data that we have to support that. And if it ever went to, if we had an impartial hearing, I know the impartial hearing officers will frequently ask, can we have the teacher's data around the IEP goals and why it was developed the way it was? So that's just something, I mean, that's not as often, that doesn't happen very frequently, but it is something that if we ever ended up in that kind of a situation where we were trying to say, we want to move in this direction and it doesn't match with maybe what a parent or family or even an agency sees, the data is important to have available. Just a compliant lens.
Thanks, Jean. So I just want to draw your attention to the yellow box in the middle. Teacher observation is really not an acceptable method of measurement unless the objective data is being recorded each time. So I want you to think about that as you're choosing your method. And then the schedule is not when we report progress to parents. We need to choose a tool that does not change the criteria of the goal when used for data collection. And the schedule should be set for frequent and systematic progress monitoring to allow for adjustments to the teacher's method. We really should be using objective measurement tools like checklists, rubrics, assessments, and scores. And we really need to ensure that anyone that's collecting data has been trained to do it. Okay, so having our teaching assistants, paraprofessionals, gen ed teacher, anybody collect data, they can do it. It's just how we teach them to do that. So, having a checklist for them, using a rubric, it's really going through and modeling for them as the student is actually doing what they need to do, how to collect that data. Okay, and once again, I'm going to drive back home for that schedule. The schedule is not when we report that progress to parents. It's really about when we're going to sit down as a team, because it should be not just you, but the whole team, to look at the data and inform that and shift and adjust as needed.
Shannon, can I also interject and say under that schedule? So that's when you're gonna take that data collection and formally collect it and look at it. You can collect data every day. If you're doing a frequency, a tally sheet of some sort for tracking behaviors, I'm thinking of our RCSD classrooms, that's intensive daily tracking. You could be doing CVC words every day, depending on the grade of your student. So you can collect data every single day. The schedule is, I'm going to sit down with my collected data every 2 weeks, and I'm going to look and see how the student is progressing so that I can adjust what I'm doing. If you're explicitly working on this skill every day for 2 weeks and there hasn't been progress made, maybe we need to adjust what we're doing. So maybe we look at that data and say, hey, the student was out, they were quarantined, they've missed 10 days of school. I don't necessarily need to adjust what I'm doing. We can keep doing it. We just need the student here, and we might see some different results. So the schedule is that formalized analysis of that data to see what we need to adjust.
And I know my consultant teachers at the secondary level are thinking about collecting this and really having the time to analyze the data and work with, in a consultant role, you may only see them during ELA, or you may only see them during math, or in an integrated classroom, just the way that the secondary schedule is built. So we did ask for feedback from the Regional Partnership Center as we developed this professional learning on how to ensure that we were able to do this, with fidelity. And their feedback was to collaborate with the general education teacher, as they are also knowingly signing off on that dissemination log at the beginning of the year, knowing and understanding those students' IEP goals. So as you're thinking about how you could do this strategically during a school day at the secondary level with kids that cover multiple classes with multiple teachers, collaborating with your general education teacher to ensure that there are these different procedures in place to collect this data. So then at progress monitoring time, when we are reporting out to families, we have the necessary feedback to share with our families that are focused on the data as it relates to that specific annual goal. And your associate directors and the department can help if there is some need for collaboration with your gen ed teachers. Okay, we're going to play another self-check for understanding. So are these measures objective or subjective? So number of trials, I hope you said it's objective. Demonstrate knowledge of is very subjective, open to interpretation. Increase ability to, subjective. Within X amount of time, that's very specific. You can measure that. Understand the concept, subjective. Number of times, objective. Amount of time, objective. And then decrease occasions of is still subjective. So think about, as you're writing your IEP goals, what this would look like, and if somebody else could interpret what you're putting there. Is it something that they can measure, or is it kind of subjective and open to their own interpretation?
So going back again to our goals, we had our criteria period, now our method, our tool, what are we going to use to collect and assess this data? We're going to use work samples. This is again, let's work smarter, not harder. This is an exit ticket. This is something that we can do to collect this data. I'm going to look at the work sample and I'm going to schedule that for every 2 weeks. So I might collect maybe 3 work samples a week, but every 2 weeks, I'm going to go through that and I'm going to adjust as needed. You know, when we consider work samples, it allows us to really pinpoint where that breakdown is. So I'm, 3-4 months into this goal, and the students really getting that one-step word problem. They're able to identify that operation and solve that one step, but they're really struggling with applying that second step. So now I can adjust my instruction to meet that need, because I've been looking every 2 weeks at really fine-tuning where the student is in that goal. For the next goal, we said 90% on 5 occasions. So I'm really going to use a teacher devised test or worksheet, and I'm going to base it off that 200 CVC word list that I used right in the beginning. I'm going to print out the list. I'm going to highlight the words that they know, the words that they don't know. Every time I give them this teacher made assessment, I'm not going to keep giving them the same words because it's the same skill over and over. So I'm going to just continue to make sure that I can identify, that the student can increase that identification on 5 occasions. And the words are already there. You're just going to kind of pull out, right, those 20 words every time you do it. And I want to look at this weekly, right? If my student's getting the A's, because I'm highlighting on that master sheet and they're really good on A, I'm going to take A out of the equation and I'm going to keep working on those other ones and adjust it there. So we can, kind of, again, adjust what we're doing in as far as progress monitoring and then adjusting our teaching. The last one, 9 out of 10 occasions, we're going to do a self-monitoring checklist. This student has already been able to identify that this is a weakness for them, and this is something that they need to develop further. So I'm assuming that this student is at the level where they can kind of identify and check off on a self-monitoring checklist. Obviously, I'm going to kind of peek in on that self-monitoring checklist at the end of every day and ensure that it's accurate. If it's not, maybe having those conversations. And this is going to be something that's turned in daily. Maybe, it's something that the student is going to do on their own. They're going to share it daily. I can put notes on it and we can adjust, so maybe it's something that's going to be shared with the counselor if the student has counseling, and it's going to be a team approach to work on this goal with the student.
Okay, we're going to move ahead to, as we further unpack the goal, look at the conditions now. We did mention the conditions a little bit earlier in the presentation. What we want you to think about when you're considering conditions is what conditions may the student need to demonstrate the skill. So as Shannon shared with her secondary example earlier, a student may require us as the teacher to provide a condition so that they can demonstrate that skill that we've identified in their goal. For the example of the graphing calculator. I do want you to think about, when you are thinking about conditions, go back to what we had talked about isolating the skill. So if when you've isolated that skill, if you need to provide a condition that's not related to the skill so that they can demonstrate it, we should create that and write that into the goal. I also want you to think about what other adaptations may be necessary for the student to have meaningful interaction with that content and that skill. And then also, if you do decide to use a condition, please make sure that it's very clear, very specific, and very explicit to how that will be used so the student can demonstrate that other isolated skill that you've identified in the goal. When you think about conditions, we have kind of 3 bucket areas that you could look at with conditions, looking at scaffolding, adapting a level. An example of that would be when given a 3rd grade passage or a passage at the 3rd grade reading level. We can think about conditions as it pertains to supports. So providing an accommodation, for example, when given a verbal prompt, that would be a condition that we would provide to that student in order to see that goal be demonstrated. Or by environment. So we could be identifying a specific setting or a specific situation where we would really see that child demonstrate that skill. So for example, the language would be in a familiar setting with a known adult. Those are conditions that we as the special educators need to make sure are in place prior to asking the child to demonstrate that skill. Those are the conditions that we intervene on.
And I think sometimes we think about, well, can I give them that condition? Can they have access to that? I think this is where we think about that present level of performance. Are we already using it with them in the classroom, right? Is it something that is a need for them in order for them to access that general education curriculum? I also, look at the testing accommodations. Are these things that they have access to when they are showing that mastery or taking a state or a regents exam? So these are some condition examples. If you are going to use these, they should be highlighted in the present levels of performance that it's something of need. Okay, so if it's when given a graphic organizer, and this is not just any old graphic organizer, there should be some specificity to that graphic organizer, that type. Okay, and it should be also easily able to be understood by another teacher working with that student, that that's the graphic organizer that they're using, and that that's the graphic organizer that's tied to that goal. When interacting with an unfamiliar adult during physical education, being very specific when they need that. When given text at their independent reading level. So if you're looking at that goal, it's at their independent reading level, not grade level text. Okay, and if you are giving grade level text, another condition might be when read out loud. Okay, when given an editing checklist for their writing passage, they're going to show blah, 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 blah. When listening to a passage, as I highlighted a second ago, during small group instruction, or when given a calculator. This is, my little plug for, our students that are middle school to high school. They may not know their math facts. They may not be able to do that, but to have them held back from being able to solve a multi-step equation due to the computation piece, not necessarily isolating the skill of following a multi-step direction, could hinder their progress in that area. So thinking about that calculator.
Shannon, go ahead, Jean.
I was going to add, this is where I believe earlier, Shannon, you had said in the present levels, when you're describing the student's current level and what they need versus they benefit from. So this is where the language would need to be up in the present levels to say needs a graphic calculator versus benefits from, or does better with, or likes to have. or works when given this. So that's where you want to make the language clear that we need to do these things, and then they're incorporated into the goal as well later on.
That's a great point. And the piece of like, what if I don't have it? What if they won't have it? So like access to a word processor, that text to the written speech, some of those things, if they're really needing them, then we need to talk about what that looks like on that student's IEP. So when given a word processor, they're able to write 3 paragraphs. So that would be another condition. But what if they don't have a computer or a Chromebook? So that's another piece that would have to be brought into that conversation. But if we're saying it's a condition that they are going to use for showing that they've mastered that goal, it really should be written into that present level and should be something they have access to all the time.
I was going to say, when we're thinking about these conditions, again, aligning to that data, that baseline data. So we get this baseline data. We have an 8th grader who's reading independently at a 3rd grade reading level. So the goal is for them to, answer comprehension questions. But if we don't specify, are they reading it or are they listening to it? Is it at grade level if they are reading it, or is it at their independent reading level? We really have to make sure, because otherwise we don't know what we're measuring, and we're giving a student a goal that immediately off the bat they can't access. So if the goal is for them to answer comprehension questions and you haven't stated that the passage is going to be read to them, whether it's, a human reader or a computer reader, they can't access it because your data showed that they can't read it independently. So it really isn't a comprehension goal. It's a reading goal, because they've got to be able to read it before they can comprehend it. So going back and really thinking about that concept and the skill, what is the skill that they need, and do they have that background to understand the concept of it, and can they access the goal without anything? So if it's at their independent reading level, then they can access it because they can read it on their own. It doesn't have to be read to them. But that's, again, going to be more work when we're talking about students who are in upper grades, because now you've got to find, a document, that's at their reading level, but still has, relevant content for them. So given a calculator too, we have lots of, again, secondary students with adding and subtracting goals. Do they understand the concept? Adding makes more, subtracting makes less, dividing is splitting it up as evenly as possible. They get a calculator for the test. Like Shannon said, we already know that these are things that they have. Let's up that ante and kind of bring that rigor into that goal, and let's work on something a little closer to grade level. So again, the conditions aren't mandatory when we're writing a goal, but when we consider, could I bump this goal up a little harder if they're given something?
Great. Thanks, Shannon.
So this is a little template, and this relates all the way back in the very beginning when we had that chart that talked about the goal, criteria period, and those questions to ask ourselves as we're writing these goals. This is a little template that we can use. So given a condition, we don't need it, right? That's not a mandatory piece of the goal, but if we choose, given the condition, or we could just start with student, and we're going to use their name, what is the skill? How well are they going to do it? How long are they going to do it for? As evaluated by, this is our tool, our measurement, and how often, our frequency and our schedule. So this is what the goal looks like all together. When you're creating the goal in Frontline, it's not broken down like this. You do your skill and then you plug in those other pieces through drop downs. So if you find it easier to use this template, you can write out the goal this way and then plug it into Frontline, because now you already know what you're looking for, instead of looking at all the drop downs being like, oh man, okay, I didn't even think about it this way. Use this template. Now you know what you're looking for, and then you can go in. So the example given, a 4-function calculator, James will, here's his skill, solve 10 one-step word problems using addition and subtraction. With how well does he have to do this to master it? 90%. How long does he have to do it to master it? 3 consecutive weekly trials. is evaluated by scoring of what is my method, teacher-made assessments, and my schedule every 2 weeks.
All right, Amy, it's time to progress monitor.
Thank you, Shannon. I was just thinking about that last slide. I really love how you made it so it was the color coded in the different sections. I think what a powerful tool to pull out when you are writing your goals and reference as you're trying to come up with each of the components of the goal through that process. So thank you for that. We're going to move to our last piece that we're going to talk about today in relation to the measurable annual goals, which is our progress monitoring. We finally got to that point where we are going to objectively determine the progress towards the goals using the data collection and analysis that we've talked about.
And it is progress monitoring time. I am going to plug that too. So
Yes,
it
it is
window
that time.
And the window
Because
is
we're
open
getting
right now.
ready to report the progress to our parents now.
So we need to go through all of the different drop downs in Frontline and really talk about what they mean. The first one, achieved. So with that, it's showing the data that shows that that student has specifically achieved that goal. Progressing satisfactory, you're expecting that they're going to achieve it based on your data, and you're reporting the data out to show that they are making that progress that should show that they're achieving it at the end of that IEP period. So once again, anniversary IEP, you may be working on a goal and that document may be ending in December. So you're at that end point, you're in that last progress monitoring box, and you're showing that I'm expecting it to be achieved, or it's progressing satisfactory. Progressing gradually, making less than anticipated progress, but still may achieve the goal. So when I think about this one, I think about a kid that, each week or whenever my schedule is for progress monitoring that goal, I see, some ups and some downs. They're slow. The progress might be very slow and steady, but they're still making progress, but I'm not really anticipating they're going to master that goal. Okay. And then progressing inconsistently, you're basically saying at this point, they may not reach this goal. That could be for a variety of factors. Attendance could be a factor in why they are progressing inconsistently. And it is the notation that I think we shared last year that we would like you to use if that attendance is that factor for progressing inconsistently, because the data is inconsistent. C comment, which is the one we should be using the least, is the one that we see the most. And this designation really shows that you can't rate that student. You're saying you cannot rate that student in one of the following areas, and there is a written narrative there for it. When we did a poll to look at what feedback is in this section, when we see C comment, some of the things that we noted are, we have not started working on this IEP goal. And that is a red flag, especially from the state lens, looking at our IEP goals, because if we're saying that that is an area of need for that student, how are we not working on that goal? We may be working on a piece of it, one of the scaffolds leading up to that goal, to mastery, but we can't just not be working on it. And we tend to see these most when we're choosing curriculum goals, because it just doesn't happen in that curriculum yet. I'm guilty of choosing these goals when I was a teacher, in saying this comment, but it's not something that we can do anymore. We really need to be identifying where that student falls, just like we do when we report out on a report card, where they are. And then we need to match that with data. As we get to the close of this first progress monitoring window, we will be pulling IEPs or progress monitoring and losing my train of thought. We will be pulling them and letting you know if you have not completed your progress notes, but not just looking at that piece, but also looking at the goal and looking at if it was measured or if there was any data that was shared out under that comment section. So if you're choosing achieved, there should be data that matches that. Shannon D, I don't know if I explained that well. I got lost in my words.
No, I think you were doing a good job with that. I think the key, what you're saying is that we definitely have to have that data in there to support where you've gotten your comments from. again, that C comment should be the least that we see. And you're right, we see it the most, but we really need to have the data that supports where is the child currently functioning with that goal. And just to kind of add, we have continued work with CEQA this year. And part of the things that CEQA is coming in and looking at are our evaluation tools. And we have not gotten into the details, but I have a feeling one of the evaluation tools they're going to want to look at is our progress monitoring to the goals. And so that's really critical that we up those and we make sure that we are adding that baseline data that says if the goal's at 80%, where's the child after the first reporting? Oh, they're at 30%. Okay, let's continue to move that way. But again, even if you say the child, is going to progressing satisfactorily, and you think they're going to make the goal by the end, you should still have where are they currently? Goals at 80, they're at 75%. That kind of goes along with that comment. Works hand in hand with it.
Right. Good point. I do want to reiterate again that it should be a very rare occurrence that you are selecting C comment. We will be having some more conversations about that, but regardless of where we are in the content or in the coursework, if a student has a goal that's written for a specific skill, we can't wait until that part of the content and curriculum to work on that. We have to work on that goal as according to the schedule that we've outlined that on the goal. So if you have questions about that, you need more specific guidance on what to do in certain situations. I know situations get tricky, and every situation might need a different level of support. So please reach out to your associate director if you're getting stuck on how you could note progress towards a goal and you're leaning towards C comment and you need some guidance, please reach out.
So how do we do this, right? How do we progress monitor? And I shared earlier on that it really needs to be collaborative between you as the special education teacher, related service provider, and your general education teacher, because that is the teacher that is providing that content in situations such as consultant teacher, integrated. If you only see them for resource room, it's a little bit different. And if you're not a special class teacher, you have a little more control there. So when that general education teacher signs off on that IEP dissemination log, they know and they understand their responsibility in implementing that IEP. One piece that I think we often overlook is how they can support us in progress monitoring the IEP goals. Okay. And this could be done through a ticket out the door. This could be done through that, the initial activity when they come into the classroom. It could be done through a center's activity. There's a variety of ways, but I think that if we don't involve them in the discussion, they won't know how they can support us with this. I think everybody's open to supporting and helping us with the data collection. And I know it can be especially frustrating at this point in the year when you're like, okay, I have to get data to inform my progress note to the family. You email them and they say they don't have anything, and so I think that if we can start to have these conversations as we look at what we receive from our gen ed teachers and how we write our progress notes during this first window, and thinking about all of the information presented today moving forward, we can be really collaborative and they can support us in this process. So progress monitoring obviously provides that data-based evidence for how that student is progressing toward their annual goals. Progress monitoring is based on the schedule set forth in the goal. As we've shared over and over again, you may collect that more frequently and you will collect that more frequently, especially when we're working towards something and we want to see how that kiddo is doing. We record that progress monitoring in Frontline every 10 weeks. So if you think about it that way, that's when we report it out, that summary of performance. Okay, so it's really important though, as we think about this, we know who is responsible for collecting the data and making the progress in Frontline. We use formative assessments and we use parent-friendly terms. So the same way that we're developing those present levels of performance, the same way we're sharing that information on a progress note to the family to make it make sense to them. What we don't do is assume progress monitoring will be completed in Frontline by that case manager. You should really check in advance of that due date. So I'm thinking of situations at the secondary level where you may have a student for math, somebody else has a student for ELA, and you're all kind of supporting different content areas. It's kind of determined by the building. Some buildings I've worked in, the case manager collects all that information and puts all that information into Frontline. In other buildings, each person has a role in reporting progress in Frontline. The ELA teacher reports out on the ELA goal. It's just really important we have that conversation with everybody as we look at that IEP and think about the dissemination process for how we're going to get the information and how we're going to report it out so that it makes sense.
You know, Shannon, you made me think of one thing. I really liked your example of relying on our colleagues to help us collect some of that progress monitoring data, but also keeping in mind that as the special education teacher or the related service provider that is responsible for that goal, it is your responsibility to take all those pieces and analyze that so that then you can report out the progress. While you might ask your colleague who's in the classroom with the teacher the majority of the time to assist you with getting that data, it is up to you to analyze it and then report on it. So I did want to share an example of a comment. So we're going to talk a little bit about comments right now as we're reaching almost the end of our time. I did want to let you know that it is required that you not only know how the child is progressing towards that goal, but you also write a comment for each goal that you are responsible for. That is a requirement that you write a comment for each goal, and the comment that you write must contain the data that you used to make that decision about how that child is progressing. So for example, this one here is progressing gradually. Student was able to print their first and last name 32 out of 80 over the last 10 weeks. So the student is progressing gradually towards the 12-month goal. This progress is based on the evidence stated above with consideration to time. This is week 20 of 40 weeks into the IEP. So very specific information, how that child is doing so that you could make that decision that this child is progressing gradually on this specific goal.
And as you're writing your comments, if you need support, you need to figure out kind of how to tweak your statement, how to, really make sure that it speaks parent-friendly language. Please reach out to our unit and come to our office hours, share what you're thinking about. Reach out to your associate director. We can provide you with some feedback on how to make these make sense and how to put the right information in here. And as I shared earlier, as we run that listing to determine if students are missing progress notes, we'll also be looking to be able to provide you some feedback as well. So we have reached the conclusion of this presentation, but don't worry, there's more excitement coming down the line. Amy, do you want to?
Yeah, so just wanted to share, as I talked about in the beginning of our presentation, this is a 3-part series on data-driven IEP development. The next piece that we will discuss later in the year, another offering, is our part 3, which is where we will take a look at the supplemental aids and services, program accommodations and modifications, and testing accommodations, as well as special transportation. And we are going to link that to the data in the present levels as well. So I do want to remind you that your input and feedback and questions are important to us. So please go ahead and click that link to the parking lot if you have not, and you have something that you would like to share with us so that we can get you a response to your question. We do have some resources that I know Shannon is going to go through with you quickly that you can click through when you have the opportunity on your own. These are some tools that Shannon D'Agostino has developed for you. Also, the New York State Annotated IEP is linked as well. So I'll turn it over to her. And then before we do sign off, we do have a few more housekeeping closing items that we want to share with you. So Shannon, if you wanted to unpack the additional resources before we turn it over to Shannon Markin.
Yep. So right in the beginning, we had looked at that skills concept. So Shannon, can you click on that for me? Thank you. So this is a tool that not only teachers can use, but ADs can use as well. Sorry.
Of course, it asks me to sign in right now as I start. To
No,
click.
that's okay. And it's gonna pull out, those skills, concept, both. And then it's just a quick look. Is it observable? Is it not observable? Is it measurable? Is it not measurable? So that you can kind of take a quick look at the sheet and know where you're going as you're writing these goals, or when you're in a CSE meeting, to kind of take just a quick look at that language to check that out. When we talk about, you can go back to the slides.
Can I just plug something too, as
Okay.
a district representative, and I know associate directors are here, district reps are here, joining along on this presentation. This is something that I might have next to me as I'm looking through the IEP to help kind of drive the conversation, because sometimes we may chair a meeting for a colleague at a different grade level, and we're just thinking about kind of what that looks like, and just having this here kind of supports and on that on the spot kind of need that we may have at that CSE meeting to drive that conversation to really produce that quality document.
So the other one, the IEP progress monitoring tool, you don't have to click on that, Shannon. It's a simple way that you can, track, how to keep track of all of your goals. You can put the student name, you can put their goals, and then it's based on month and how many times you observe them, in a formal way that you're collecting that data, just a sample way that you can collect some of that data and hang on to it. But I really want, Shannon, if you could click on the academic.
This is my favorite. And some of you guys may have already seen this because I started sharing it a little bit with some teachers as we are writing to develop, IEPs, or with substitute teachers. If you're the case manager and you're supporting the IEP development for a kiddo that maybe you don't work with necessarily all the time, this is a great resource. And I'm going to stop talking because it's Shannon's resource, but I just love it so much.
No, you're fine. So one of the things, we're saying, try not to use the drop down. It's very standards based. I wanted to make sure that we had something that you can refer to that's not the drop down. And these are some of those skill based questions that you can ask yourself and kind of run through this with the kids. Can they identify the theme? Yes, they can with grade level text. Yes, they can with lower level text, or nope, not at all, or only if it's read to them. So now I know they understand the concept of theme, but they can't read the text. So this is a reading problem, not a comprehension problem. So kind of identifying reading and then comprehension. There's some questions for math. Math is a little more scaffolded by grade level. It's not every skill, but it's pretty much the majority of the big skills that they would need. So we've got we've got K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and then secondary on here. And you can go through and just kind of, this can give you that jumping off point of where you want to target some of your goals. And then there's a social one, social emotional one too. So when we think of that social present level of performance, it's a separate click, Shannon, on the slide. Sorry. Again, these are some skills that we can consider: interactions with adults and staff, interactions with peers, following school directions, advocating for themselves. So Shannon, if you could scroll down. So this will help you develop your PLEPs, but it's also going to help you develop your goals because it can target some of those skills, including student voice, parent voice, that age appropriate transition. There's some boxes that you can just check off, and kind of guide your planning of, your narrative for your PLEP. And then you can say, listen, this is a need. Let me get some data on this, because this is where I think our goal needs to be. And this is just, again, a jumping off point to help us get away from those drop downs and find some skill-based goals that are appropriate to where the student is.
Those are another really great resource for us as chair people to have at our table when we are chairing meetings that we may not be, they're not a kiddo that we support on a regular basis. So just to kind of drive the conversation to support developing those present levels of performance and thinking about what that kid needs, what that skill is that they need in order to access that grade level content and what should be the real focus. And then the last piece is just the New York State annotated IEP. We've shared this in a lot of our different trainings. And that is another great resource for helping to think about some of those questions as you develop your present levels of performance. and aligning it with the other areas of the IEP. So I did find out from True North Logic that you are all able to register now. If it should no longer say full. If you have any trouble registering, you are going to send an email to True North Logic. But I did get confirmation that it has been increased to over 1,000. So we appreciate you registering for that. If you already are registered, you should have received an email or will receive an email momentarily with the survey. That survey needs to be filled out in order to acknowledge attendance for today's training. Once we compile that list, we give you credit. You know, you will also get a survey through True North Logic that then initiates that attendance piece. If you do not receive a survey by 1 o'clock, please email True North Logic. And I think, Amy, you're just gonna finish this up here.
Yes, thank you so much. I did want to say, I just checked True North Logic and I believe we have at least 846 people here today listening to this presentation because that's how many people are registered. So I think this was a great opportunity for all of us as special educators to join together and take a deeper dive into our measurable annual goals and basing that on the data in our present levels. So really want to thank you for joining us, and a huge thank you to Shannon and Jean for joining me in this presentation and spending a lot of time developing these materials and content. This link will be live on YouTube, so it can be revisited at any time, and you can rewind and revisit any sections of this presentation. In addition, the presentation itself was emailed out. If you were in True North Logic earlier today, we will send it again when we send a follow-up email in the coming days. Please be patient with us as we get your attendance in True North Logic. You will get that True North Logic survey in a few days. The survey today you'll get instantly, but we want to make sure that you give us a couple days to get it in True North Logic so that you can get that prompt there. So with that, we are all set. We will let you go on to the rest of your day. We hope you have a good rest of Superintendent's Conference Day.